guys. So I was a teenager, and that perspective is often very different than, you know, if you're an adult or if you're involved in directly in all the big things that are happening. If you have any questions, please keep them maybe towards the end. I'm going to try and like talk for maybe half an hour or so, and then we can take all the questions at the end. And it's not a very formal, it's really, so I'm not going to be giving you a history lesson. I really just wanted to kind of share my perspective growing up as a kid, as a teenager, in a country as part of the Soviet Union, and kind of what my experiences were. So, for those of you, okay, I don't know if you can see it very well, but for those of you who do not know where Latvia is, and there might be many of you, because it's such a tiny country that most people normally don't know where it is. So there we go, it's this purple one there. And if you look, this is sort of today's map of Europe. So African continent down below here, they've got France, Germany, Poland, Russia on the east. So the geographical border of Europe actually is the Ural Mountains. So half of Russia, technically speaking, is in Europe, the other half in Asia. And then in the south, it's Turkey, the Turkish Straits. So Latvia actually sort of sits right in the middle there, on the Baltic Sea, across the sea from Sweden, Finland, Norway, so very close to Scandinavia. It's a tiny country. When I was growing up, there were about 2.5 million people who lived there. And now there's probably just under 2 million, so that's like half a Cape Town in the whole country. The size-wise, Latvia is the same size as Holland. Yeah, so this is what it kind of looks like now. But if you think during the Cold War, during the Soviet Union days, this is basically what Soviet Union looked like. So Soviet Union was a gathering, or a union of 15 very different, from a cultural point of view, from an ethnic point of view, from a religious point of view, 15 completely different countries and nations. So Latvia was declared its independence in 1918, and then with the onslaught of the world wars, in August 1940, so just before the Second World War, there was something called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which was signed between the Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, that basically divided the spheres of influence in Central and Eastern Europe between the Nazi Germany and the Soviets. So the Baltic countries, so the 3 Baltic countries, which are these here, so Latvia, the purple one, Lithuania, and Estonia in the north, they were basically sacrificed to the Soviets. So this sort of illegal annexation of the Baltic countries into the Soviet Union, it lasted for 50 years. So from the 1940, I was born in 1977, so basically, you know, very well into the whole Soviet Union setup. So my parents obviously and my grandparents remember things very differently. I was born into it, grew up, and then during my teenage years the whole system came crumbling down. But basically, when the Soviet annexation happened, what the kind of the aim of the ideology was to destroy the upper middle class and the educated population of all the countries, sort of systemically destroy it. So tens of thousands of people were deported to Siberia, to Soviet labor camps, concentration camps, in like cattle, you know, in the trains, cattle trains, basically, to get rid of the thinking, basically, part of the country, because the lesser educated masses were easier to control, so easier to kind of push through the ideology that was prevalent in the Soviet Union. So it was actually like a really tragic time, and every single family in Latvia you would find has family members who died in Siberia, in labor camps, in concentration camps. So But that's how they managed to control kind of what was going on in the country and to control the population and kind of forward their ideology. So if you think of USSR, it was a huge country or group of republics. It was about 290 million people, so it was the third largest country at the time after India and China. And one thing, so the next thing I want to share with you guys is from my school days. So if you think of the 290 million people, and okay, I don't know how many of those were school children, but so here, you have a few pictures. Those are not my pictures, but just some pictures of kids at school, primary school. But one thing that was very prevalent in Soviet Union or growing up was that sameness is good. Sameness was encouraged. Any form of individuality, any form of being different was squashed and really discouraged. That would be a polite way to put it. So you think of all these 15 countries spanning from like Northern Europe all the way to Asia. Every single every single pupil, so school-going age child. Sorry, that was a bit of a mouthful. But so all the pupils wore exactly the same school uniform. So you can see here, it doesn't matter what age. Okay, boys and girls are obviously different. So the boys had these blue. Dark blue like blazers and trousers, and girls all had a navy blue dress, and you had to wear a white pinafore for like special days, like first day of school, last day of school, Lenin's birthday, and those kind of special occasions. You had to wear a white pinafore, and then on other days you had to wear a black one. And the only way to express in any sort of individuality was, so we had these detachable white collars and white cuffs. So those, if you were lucky or if your mom or granny knew how to sew, you could sew different ones. I mean, they had to be white, but they could have like a different, I don't know, different little lace thingy here or a look slightly different. So that was the only thing that was different. Everything else was exactly the same across all the 15 republics. And then, another interesting thing, so I'm ethnic Latvian. If you think of the 15 republics, each one of these republics speaks a different language. My language is Latvian. It is like English and Chinese to Russian. Russians use Cyrillic alphabet, Latvians use Latin alphabet. So it has nothing, it's not a Slavic language. It's completely different. So one of the things that happened during the Soviet times was that every single child had to study Russian from grade R. So I went to a Latvian school because I was ethnic Latvian, but I had to study Russian from grade 0. And interestingly enough, so these two things that I mentioned, so the uniforms, which we all really detested, and studying Russian, that was compulsory for absolutely everyone. So when Soviet Union collapsed, and I was about 14, so I was like in grade 7, I think. So one of the things that happened, and it happened in the middle of a kind of towards the end of a school year, but the school year wasn't finished yet, and they basically did away with the uniforms, and they did away with having to study Russian compulsory. So everybody, every single person that I knew dropped the Russian as a subject, and nobody ever wore a uniform again. So it was like, it was so interesting because like, first, I mean, if you think about the Russian language, there is nothing wrong with the Russian language. It's an incredible language which is so rich culturally, literature, etc. So it's not the language that's to blame, but that was like our only way to kind of protest and say, see, we're done with it. And same with the uniforms. Now, when I'm a mom of 2 school-going children, I remember, so both of my children were born here in South Africa, and when they started school, I thought, oh my gosh, we're back to uniforms. Like, how can this be? But now here, every single school has a different uniform, and there are like 10 different uniform options for sports, and this sports, and that sports, and and I was really, that like really stressed me out, and I see also the benefit that there is a uniform versus, you know, everybody kind of showing off their latest acquisitions over the weekend, but when I was growing up, it was a very different thing. And then another interesting thing to mention, so you see these red scarves, and then you can't really see them closely. Oh, here you can see them closely, and closer. So another very organized, structured thing that happened in the Soviet Union was indoctrination of the youth, of children from like the word go. So there were 3 different organizations for school children. So the first one was Oktoberfest for basically primary school, well, like foundation phase up to like age 9. Then from 9 to 14 they were pioneers, and then from 14 up to like mid-20s was Komsomol. So these 3 organizations were basically avenues, organized avenues of indoctrination of communist principles, ideologies, etc., and basically preparing the next generation of Communist Party members. So we all had to wear these badges, and then, so Oktoberfest only had a badge, then Pioneers you had a special badge and this red scarf, and then Komsomol had a red scarf and a different badge and I think some kind of funky hat as well that had to occasionally be worn. And if you think, so it was a very strict, there were so many rules around it. So there were very strict roll calls. If you look here, this is like our personal trunch ball. And roll calls, we had to, you see there's a line there, and you had to line up to the line. You could not step one step over it or one step back because you got punished. You had to stand at the line, and if you look here, like the girls' dresses are also the same length. So depending on how tall you were, it was like your problem, but you had to make sure that you fixed your dress to be the correct length. Otherwise, you got punished. And these organizations were organized in like brigades, or like troops, and then they competed against each other, and there were a lot of enforced, compulsory things that you were supposed to do, and events that you were supposed to take part. So, and even though, as a kid, on the other side, if you don't think of the ideology, because I obviously, you know, I was like 10, for example, I wasn't thinking about any ideology back there, but I just hated the fact that everything was compulsory. So choice was not really like a big thing in my life growing up. Another thing that was, so this whole being part of the Communist Party or being a member of Communist Party was obviously very much influenced your career prospects and what happened to you kind of as an adult. And I can tell you as an example, my parents, for instance, were not part of the Communist Party, and so my dad's a scientist. He's a chemical engineer, and his scientific work was basically limited because he was not part of the Communist Party, so he was not allowed to have publications, and so he basically, they just said to him, okay, well, this is where you're going to get to, and he basically worked at the Riga Technical University his whole life as a professor. He's still a professor there, but he couldn't really advance his scientific career in any way. And same for my mom. My mom was an English teacher at actually the same high school or secondary school where I went, and same thing. So she was not a member of the Communist Party, so she could never like advance and be, I don't know, head of department or something like that, or a principal. Yeah, so it was something that was definitely enforced. Then this is something else interesting. You can't really see. It's like quite a crappy picture, but what I wanted to show you was, so one of the things that happened with the Soviet Union was that all private property was confiscated, and all the farms were joined into these big collective farms called kolkhoz. And then obviously they needed people to work these collective farms. So during holidays, they would use students and pupils to work the fields. So this was one of these compulsory things. So not every summer, but maybe when I was like 12, 11, 12, 13. So for 2 weeks of our summer holiday, and here is another thing. So summer holidays in Latvia, still to this day, are 3 months long. So school ends on the 31st of May and starts on the 1st of September, always. Maybe because it's so dark and I don't know for the rest of the year, but my youngest boy is very desperate to move to Latvia because he just wants to have a 3 month summer holiday. But anyhow, so for a couple of weeks of the summer holiday, this is what, I don't know what it looks like from far, it's not a very clear picture, but that's basically the idea is it's a field of sugar beets. So we had to weed sugar beets 6 hours a day, 4 hours in the morning from 8 to 12, then we would stay at hostels, like we would be somewhere in the countryside at a hostel of like a technical school there, stay at hostels. From 8 to 12, you get your hoe and you hoe sugar beets, and then you come back to the school, have a 2-hour lunch break, and then I was very lucky because I didn't have to go back in the afternoons to do it, because I used to dance. I was part of a dance group, so we had practices in the afternoon, and everybody else had to go back from 2 to 4, hoe more sugar beets. And we didn't get paid. And one row was often like a kilometer long. It was flippin' depressing. It was really depressing. And you just like, you start and you don't even see the end. Then we actually are live. We did get paid. I checked with my sister yesterday if we ever got paid. And she said we did get paid like some kind of a few kopecks. But you got paid not per hours. Like, you know, now you would get paid per hour if you do any sort of a work. We got paid per how many kilometers of sugar beets you hoed. So basically, by the end of June, all the fields were clean and ready, you know, for the summer season. So that's what we did. And same thing happened in autumn when it was harvest time for potatoes and stuff like that. But then the other side of it is, I mean, it sounds quite dreadful, but the other side of it, so if I think of my memories of that, aside from the fact that, of course, nobody loved doing this, and I think I almost had like a childhood trauma for gardening from my summers. But aside from that, we had such a great time there, because imagine like you're on a camp for 2 weeks with your mates, with like sort of a little bit of supervision, but not too much. We would like wake up, you know, after supper when lights were out, we'd sneak up the dorms and go swimming in the rivers, and like it was fun, you know, it was a lot of fun. So my point with that is that, not that you should all be hoeing sugar beets in order to have some fun, but things are so dependent on your perspective and kind of on your situation. I didn't know any different. I grew up like that. Like from day one, it was just how life was. So you don't, certain things especially when you're little, you don't question because you don't know that they can be any different, and it's not like you just want to have a miserable life your whole life. So you just, you know, you make fun with what you can. And why is that not working? Oh, sorry. There. Okay. This is what shops used to look like in my childhood. So it was not about the haves and the have-nots. It was just nots, because there was nothing. So this here, this is in Russian. So this says here, socks, нет. So nosok нет, обувь нет. So socks, no socks, and shoes, no shoes. So there's nothing. This is a grocery shop, so there's nothing. This is another grocery shop, there's nothing. This is a bread shop, and it says do not touch, не трогать, in Russian. So this is also an interesting thing. So I think nowadays, growing up, we all have various circumstances, but in general, I don't think we appreciate it, that choice is a luxury. Choice is something that we don't think is a luxury, but it truly is, because when there is no choice, it is what it is. So for instance, my takeout on it is I have a huge, and you can ask my children, I have a huge issue with food wastage, because I was never hungry. I was never, I never lacked, but there just wasn't this mass of oversupply and over like choices of everything like it is today. So I have a huge issue with wasting food. So I always make sure my children finish what's on their plate because it's just something that comes from childhood. But we used to, I remember a time towards the end of Soviet Union, so when I was like a teenager, we used to have food stamps because there was no food available. So you would get, depending on how many people you had in your family, you would get, so we were 4 people, so my parents, my sister and I, and then my dad's parents, so my grandparents. So 6 people, and then depending on how many people you are, you got stamps for X many kilos of sugar, flour, oil, not like meat and things like that, but like basic stuff, food stuff, so how many loaves of bread you were, and then you would go to a shop and you would say, okay, here's my ticket, and then you would only be able to buy something. So people who worked at the distribution centers of, you know, where the food was distributed and other goods as well, they were very powerful. So you think, I don't know who we think now is a powerful person, like some fabulous businessman or whatever. But in those days, the people who worked in the trade, in the distribution centers, they were the most powerful. So you wanted to be their friends because you would know, they would tell you, you know what, on Thursday there will be something, just come to this place and there will be something. And you were not even interested in what was going to be there, you just knew there was going to be something, so you went there. And we had a neighbor, an elderly man, he was actually Ukrainian, of Ukrainian origin, and he was our neighbor, so we lived in an apartment, and then on the same landing, across the landing was his apartment. And he lived on his own, so his family, I don't know where they were in Ukraine, but so he was an elderly man on his own, and he worked in one of these places where you got access to food. And he would often tell us, because, you know, there were children in our, so obviously you'd speak to my parents, but because of my sister and I, he would say, okay, I've got something for you, come, whatever, this afternoon at 3 o'clock, and then we used to go to his office, and then he would give us, like on the slide in the courtyard, you'd come out and he would have the stuff wrapped in newspapers, so you didn't know what it was until you got home. So most often it was like sausages and Vienna sausages and like really, you know, basic things, and then sometimes cheese and sometimes like some treats for my sister and I. So this is like how you got by. But the thing is, and again I want to say, it's not like, okay, there weren't too many obese people in Latvia maybe in those days, but it's not like we lacked. You know, it's not like I grew up thinking, oh my gosh, I have like no food to eat and this is terrible. It was just different. So when there was something in the shop, this is what it looked like. So this is a shoes shop, it actually says obuv, so in Russian, shoes. So you stood there in a queue, not because you knew what shoe was there or what size or whatever, you stood there because there were shoes, because most of the time there were no shoes. So, this was a meat shop, so that was like very important. And this here, you can see this is ice cream actually. This is ice cream in like a little waffle cup. And this I remember so distinctly, as a kid, because ice cream, like there was no ice cream in the shops, if you can believe that, or anywhere for that matter. And at the place where I spent my summer holidays, so my grandparents lived in a small town, about 150 km outside of the main city where I grew up, and there was a dairy there. And you know, it was the time of like no phones, no nothing really, like no social media. So every week, like morning, we would get on our bikes, my sister and I, and you would take your own glass like container, like a jar, and we would cycle to the dairy to see that maybe they'd had they had extra cream, so they had made ice cream, maybe. And then if they had, you stood in a queue with your glass jar and they would fill it, because it wasn't filled into anything like this. But you got it filled into your jar, and then you quickly try to cycle home because you were hoping that it doesn't melt, you know, before you actually get to eat it. And more often than not, there was no ice cream. And my sister, who's 5 years older than me, was an exchange student in America that year. So she was like the first year of all Soviet kids who got to go. And my family was hosting an American girl at that time, and her and I were walking. So I was 13, she was 18, we were walking to catch a tram to go to the zoo or something. And we passed a greengrocer's and there was this queue, like around every corner. It was just so massive. So you go and have a look at what's there. And we went and had a look and they were selling bananas. Now, I'd never had a banana in my entire life. I was 13 because we just don't grow bananas. You know, it's so far up north and then there are no bananas. So there were bananas because there was some sort of a ship or something that got stuck in the port and now there were all these bananas and they obviously couldn't get rid of them. They had to get rid of them because they couldn't get to wherever they were going with these bananas. So we stood 3 hours. So then I went back to fetch my mom and then because they were still giving each person, so every person could buy X many kilos and I can't remember exactly how many kilos it was, but it was like an insane amount of bananas. You could buy so many bananas and we stood for 3 hours, got these bloody bananas, took them home, half of them were green, and then I remember distinctly that my mom dished them out like, you know, there's like a banana a day or morning and evening or something like that. It was, you know, it was like a super special thing. And I'm sure actually half of them must have like rotten because how long can bananas keep really? So I don't have that memory, but that's how it was. And then I thought, oh my gosh, like this is so exciting because now I've had a banana. Yeah. So there. Oh, and then one last thing about shops. Oh, another thing. So, most of the clothes that you could buy, so unless everybody made everything themselves, because otherwise you just look exactly the same in your same uniform, even when you were not wearing the uniform. And most of the shoes that you could buy were black or brown, maybe grey, but you know, it was like very dark and drab and horrible. And if you were getting married, you got a special license, because now you can't exactly get married like in a pair of wet black shoes. So you got this special license that allowed you to go to a special shop. And this special shop was where you could buy white shoes and white fabric and like a few other fancy things so that you could make your wedding dress. And then, I think this is like my other childhood trauma, because when my sister and I were like, you know, older teenagers and kind of, we both studied for a year as exchange students in America and anyway, and then when we had seen kind of other things, and then we decided that when we properly grow up, we're going to have a shop, a shoe shop, that is going to be called We Do Not Sell Black Shoes. That didn't happen actually, but I definitely had, like it really left such an impact on me. You can ask my husband, I met him like many years ago now, in 2001, and for many years I did not own, I think, a single piece of black clothing. Like nothing, like not a t-shirt, anything. I've kind of moved on since then, but it was like really funny. And then this is what I just wanted to show you. So as much as it was like all quite hectic, and you know, in retrospect, and now as an adult, I look back at it and I think, oh my gosh, like this was really quite hectic. But as a kid, you don't think that. I had a happy childhood. I spent 3 months of every summer, of every year, in the countryside, fields, picking berries and mushrooms and flowers in the forests, like going swimming in the lakes, rivers. Nobody owns, so all the 50% of the Latvian territory is covered with forests, 50%. So, and they mostly belong to the state, so they're not like privately fenced in. So you can just go and walk and swim and really have a good life. And then the other thing that happened, because there was no access to anything, people, I think in South Africa, people are also very resilient. And you know, when things go terrible, which happens often, like you make a plan. And in Latvia it was the same. So so most people had grandparents or some sort of relatives who lived in the countryside. And most of those people had some sort of a garden. So we all grew everything. My grandparents grew potatoes, tomatoes, cucumbers, berries, apples, everything. And then you harvest everything and you put it in the cellar, and then during the winter you have food to eat. And then you have neighbors who have cows, and then your parents send you with this milk jug in the evening to go and fetch fresh milk. Unpasteurized raw milk, nobody died, nobody got salmonella. To fetch raw milk from your neighbors. So it was great. Like, you know, they were not, we have so many other worries now. So there are it's interesting how, times change and what happens is just different things go wrong. Okay, and then, when I was, I just want one. There. No, one back.
One back.
Yeah, there, that one. So then, towards the end of the 80s, so when I was like a young teenager, and this whole Soviet Union started crumbling, there was quite an incredible event that took place. So on August 23rd, 1989, something called the Baltic Way. So it was a peaceful protest by it was on the 50th anniversary, so this was exactly 50 years after this Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which basically annexed the Baltic countries into Soviet Union. So it was a peaceful protest by the people of the Baltic countries, so Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, to draw world's attention to the situation. So about 2 million people joined hands in like a uninterrupted live human chain through the three countries. So it was over almost 700 kilometers. And it happened so it was for 15 minutes at 7 o'clock in the evening. And if you think about it, this happened in the time of no social media, no mobile phones. So, I mean, now we can hardly organize ourselves into the same room, for a meeting. But so it was really quite incredible. And people stood and just joined hands. And there was not one single interruption in this chain. And that started a lot of things that kind of then snowballed and ended up with us regaining our independence. But it was really quite an incredible thing to be part of. So I was like 12, and I remember we went with my parents. We went to the main street in Riga, which is now called or it was always called the Freedom Street, but then in those days it was called Lenin Street. And we stood there. So everybody, so that was the next picture. It was just, you can just see all the people. And then a little bit later, so here I was like 14 or so. In January 1991, when the Soviet Union really crumbled, properly started crumbling, this was also something, so you can't probably really see very well, but there was something called these barricades that happened on the 13th of January is when it started, because the Russian army basically, they started with Lithuania and then they went into the Baltic countries and tried to take over strategic buildings, things like TV towers, press houses, radio stations, Ministry of Internal Affairs, Defense Ministry, etc. And we didn't have like a big army or anything, so people of Latvia were called to come to Riga, which was the main city, which is where all these main, strategically important organizations and buildings were, and to build barricades around these buildings to just prevent Russians the military to come in. So these barricades were like, you can see, like in a way, quite ridiculous. It was like a lot of like farming vehicles with like grain and whatever, and they just would drive and they would bring logs, and then it was like all kinds of junk and stuff. So it's not like really, like real stuff. And then there were human shields. People would stand there all the way through night. So my dad was part of it, and then women would go and like make tea and coffee and sandwiches and take it to all the people who were. It's incredible how these kind of situations really unify a nation. A few people died. I also remember very distinctly that I had a tank drive past so I lived in an apartment on the 3rd floor, and the street in my apartment building was there was a tank. There were tanks driving past my bedroom window. Yeah, it was quite like unsettling. I remember it was quite unsettling, but at the same time, it was also incredibly exciting because imagine being part, being alive, when such incredibly important events take place. So, after all of this, Latvia regained its independence on 4th of May, and you know, since 2004 has been a fully fledged member of NATO and European Union. And I think I was fortunate to be alive at a very interesting time because I basically just got out of high school and I had all the doors open to me. So I had opportunities as a young person that probably now are not necessarily there because there was such a vacuum of people who, it was like all the Soviet educated, Soviet thinking masses, and then there was a vacuum. So they basically, if you were just out of school, a lot of the Western companies who came to invest in the Baltic countries, they would much rather hire young people just out of school and teach them and educate them rather than people with experience, but it's the wrong kind of experience. So it was actually a really exciting, it was a really exciting time. I'm sorry, I think I spoke for very long, so I don't know how much time we have for questions, but if you guys have any, I'm happy to answer them.
Ma'am, we probably do have to end,
Okay.
but I think if anybody has questions, maybe they can come chat to you afterwards, if that's
of
okay?
course.
Todd?
We'd like to thank you for your time and your lovely presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.